do we know we can trust the gospel writers? How do we know they didn't make up this whole story? What reason do we have to think that the gospel writers are honest? These are great questions that much of the Christian story rests upon. Well, today we're going to look at a portion of a recent talk I just put together on the reliability of the scriptures. But first, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit subscribe. Enjoy. So let's begin with the character test. Do we have reason to believe we can trust the character of the writers, not really just the Bible as a whole, but the New Testament and the Gospels? Why should we trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Well, the place you begin is to just ask, do they claim to be reporting the truth, or they claim to be just telling a story and a myth? And what's amazing, if you read the New Testament, you'll see over and over again that the biblical writers go out of their way to let us know that they're trying to preserve careful history. So Luke, by the way, what was his profession? Luke was a doctor, so he's clearly educated. Have you ever noticed how he begins his gospel? Look how he begins his gospel. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were what? Eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke's not an eyewitness, but he's investigating all the eyewitnesses carefully. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account so you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. This is an ancient way of saying I am taking the greatest care I can to record real events in history. But it's not just Luke. What about Peter? There's a new movement taking place called mythicism, where people deny that Jesus even existed. It's popular on the internet, not in academia. It's as if Peter saw this coming 2,000 years ago. Peter says, we did not follow cleverly invented stories or myths when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were what? Eyewitnesses of his majesty. Luke says, I investigated everything carefully. Peter says we were eyewitnesses. Now notice a verse I'm going to throw up there from John. I want you to notice how many senses John uses as he begins his epistle. So look closely. John says, what was from the beginning? What we've heard, what we've looked at, what we have touched with our hands. He says, we proclaim to you. How many senses does John use? Okay, if you don't know the answer to a question in church, you have two options. Jesus or three. Right? Every sermon's 3 points. Trinity, 3, or Jesus. You'll get it right. The last service, someone said 4, so I've been told this service is much sharper. But no one got the answer right, so I guess that remains to be seen. You can tell I work with high school students, right? How many senses are mentioned here? 3. 3, good. What we have heard, what we've looked at, what we've touched with our hands, we proclaim to you. See what John is saying? This isn't some ancient story we just heard about and passed on you. He says, we saw it, we touched it, we heard it, we were there, and we're passing that on to you. Now, when a story is invented, how does it often begin? When a story is made up and a fable is told, how does it begin? Once upon a time, or in a galaxy far, far away. Right? Now, we know Star Wars is fiction. It's placed in a time and a place, even if somebody thought it was true, we could never even investigate it. Now, oftentimes when witnesses are telling stories, they don't give exact particular details that can be checked out because that would overturn their story. Right? Now, what's very interesting about the Christian story is the biblical writers in the Gospels don't say in a land far away, in another galaxy, in an ancient time. They give us precise details of who, when, where, so we can go check it out. It's as if the writers are saying, look, you don't believe me? Go check it out. The evidence is there. So notice what Luke writes in chapter 3. He says, now in the 15th year, not the 14th year, not the 20th year, exact year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, not Julius Caesar, not Augustus. When Pontius Pilate was governor, of all the different governors of different regions, gives us the exact governor or prefect, and of Judea, the exact place. And Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the reign of Iturea. Do you see why I conclude we can trust these writers? They say we investigated, we saw it, we touched, we heard, we proclaimed the truth to you, we were there. And they place it in a very specific place in history we can go investigate. But there's a third piece that tells me these characters care about truth. And the question that historians ask is, does a document contain embarrassing material? Now, why is that important? Because human nature is, when we make up stories, it's either to get out of trouble or to make ourselves look better. Isn't that human nature? So, it was a number of years ago, my younger sister, left her computer open to her Facebook account. And I felt the world needed to know on her behalf how wonderful her older brother is. So I made up something like, I just want the world to know my brother's so great. He's been there for me. He loves me. I couldn't make of that. I'm like pouring it on. And the comments are like, this is so touching. I wish I had a brother like this. I mean, it was so over the top. Now, the moment my sister found it, she didn't go, oh, yep, one of my other sisters did it. She knew exactly that it was me, right? Like human nature, it's a silly example, but none of you wake up in the morning and go, you know what, I wonder what I can post on Instagram to totally humiliate and embarrass myself. Like, that's not human nature, right? If anything, we have this phenomena of everybody making their lives look so much better than it is, so people get depressed when they look on social media because everybody else's lives seem to be so wonderful except for theirs. What historians do is when they look back on ancient writings, if they find that the writer records material that's disparaging or humiliating or embarrassing, you know what they say? They say this is a sign that the writer cares about truth more than his or her own reputation in the eyes of people. That's a ring of truth. So here's the question. Do the gospel writers seem to give material that makes themselves look good? Or do they include material that's embarrassing? It's embarrassing, right? You can already think of stories. I mean, look, Peter denies Jesus 3 times, once to a little girl, it seems. Okay, no offense to little girls, but you think they would make up that story that the rock does this at Jesus' point of need? Of course not. Peter calls Jesus Satan. He calls him Satan. Now, I've done this with students like, oh, that's a good one. I'm like, no, that's not what's happening here. Like, my son is 15, and a few years ago, he's at that stage where he liked these your mama jokes. You know these jokes? I was like, you better be careful because your mama is my wife. But he goes, Dad, I got one. He goes, your mama is so poor, ducks throw bread at her. I'm like, buddy, come on. Like, he and his teammates like to try to like get each other like that. You know, it's their way of weirdly showing affection, I think. This is not what's happening in the Gospels. It's not like, oh, you got me, you called me Satan. That is not happening. This was the insult of insults. Why would they make this up? It makes no sense. 3rd disciples fall asleep in Gethsemane. 3 times. 3 times. How about sometimes the disciples don't even understand the teaching of Jesus? You think they would make this up? Let's make up a story that we don't even understand what Jesus is teaching. Like, it doesn't make sense. And by the way, who discovered the empty tomb? What does the Gospels report? Mary and the other women. Good. I thought someone was going to say Jesus. There's usually one. You've probably read this 100 times, but you know how significant that is? In that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's. It was a patriarchal culture. Now, one time given this message, I said a woman's testimony was not as significant as a man's, and a lady said, you better add the word considered in there. And I said, you're right. I correct myself. I'm not saying it's less significant, but in that culture, it was considered less significant because it was a patriarchal culture. Men were more educated as a whole than women. So if you're the disciples and you're making up this story, who's the least likely people you would invent to be the first witnesses to the empty tomb? Do you see how the Gospels have this embarrassing material contained in their why? Because these are writers that care about truth. And you know what convinced me when it's all said and done I can trust them? Is not only do they say we investigated this, we were eyewitnesses, we saw, we touched, we heard. Not only do they place it in a specific time and people and place we can investigate, not only does it include embarrassing material, when it's all said and done, you know the depth of somebody's conviction by what price they're willing to pay for that conviction. According to church history, Peter was crucified, Andrew was crucified, Philip crucified, Bartholomew flayed to death, James the Greater beheaded, Matthew killed with a sword, Matthias stoned to death, and this has nothing to do with smoking pot, just for the record. You have to clarify these days. Thomas stabbed with spears, John died after exile, Luke hanged, James was just thrown and beaten, Mark dragged death by horse, and Paul beheaded for their conviction, the risen Jesus. Now, I actually did my PhD dissertation on this, and it's sometimes hard to know when history ends and legend begins. But I think we know with confidence that these four minimally proclaimed the risen Jesus publicly and died as martyrs because they believed Jesus was risen from the grave. Friends, if you just read the beginning of Acts, you know what we discover? The apostles start preaching the risen Jesus. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison. And they're told, just stop preaching the name of Jesus and we'll leave you alone. You know what Peter says on behalf of the apostles? He says we can't because we fear God more than we fear men. I don't know what else the apostles could do to convince us that they care about truth.